I'm curious about this piece that we often hear students talk about, which is how they've tried all the behavioral methods, they've tried all these different techniques, they may have even tried breathing strategies. They may have heard about, the idea of looking after their nervous system or trying to take a nervous system approach. But still, we're finding something was not quite fully there for them. And I'm wondering if you'd be willing to speak a little bit to that more.
Absolutely. So one of the major drawing in point to EQUUSOMA was how you worded things differently and how it involved the horse more in the whole process. So the focus was more on horse human trauma recovery, and the human was not necessarily in the center of it all. Because one of the things that I felt was missing was oftentimes when we focused on a client, whether in my field of equine facilitated psychotherapy, it was a human client. The focus was often on improving symptoms or reducing anxiety or depression or whatever that human was dealing with. And in the process, it felt like we were using potentially a technique, or we were trying to, really focus on the downregulation of that person, but it often came at the expense of the horse. And it wasn't that the horses were mistreated. There was definitely, an absolute focus on the horse's well-being. But it was the little things kind of that happened that I felt like we were not noticing. And those are things that we can very easily slow down and really notice what shows up in the moment. And oftentimes there's so much more before something happens, before a behavior happens, or before a certain tension pattern in the body happens that the horse might respond to. And that was one of the things. And then, of course, there was so much more that I learned in the process in 2019 when I met you.
I think it depends on what the person's primary scope of practice is. So if you're a professional and you work with predominantly the equine as the client, the human owner, for instance, or rider might not be in the equation to the degree that we might want them to be because their influence on the equine's nervous system is quite um, very much an important part of that picture. And then in your case, Susanna, where it's more on the human as primary client, then the equine's patterning and so on is not part of the equation. And so part of the thing that we're looking at here is regardless of whatever occupation or work that you do, at this intersection of equine and human, or if it's you and the equines in your own life, in your own personal life, at your farm or that you board somewhere, how are we looking at the nervous system patterning, the relational patterning between the two? It's really a conversation between two nervous systems. And it's not as simple as just here, let's just do this breathing strategy, or, let's just, settle and ground ourselves, although that can be helpful. Um, but I'm reminded that there's just so much more. I like to think a little bit about this work as being about how do we resolve, repattern, and release what's still in the queue, what's still being held in the body. So we're not having to do so much managing of what's there, not
Mhm.
having to do so much down regulating all the time, because that is using our energy to hold energy back, I think, like Peter Levine would say. And so, how do we work through what's in the queue or what's in our system? And that involves us starting to pay attention to subtleties that we might miss within ourselves and in the animals. And I wonder if you had maybe a story to share about that, Susanna.
Mm. There's this, I think what often shows up, what I've often seen is just like fear or anxiety, and potentially that we've learned to either override the fear or downregulate the fear or mask it all together, pretend we don't feel the fear. And there's still something that happens in our body when that fear comes up, like maybe a bracing, a tightening in our body, maybe a tightening in our jaw, like shorter breath and so forth. And horses are very good at tracking physiological changes. So, and I think what's really difficult is when we as humans are not aware of what's happening in our physiology. And oftentimes, just becoming aware of it without judging, with a sense of curiosity around it, um, that can already like cause something to shift and change. Even if I just say like, wow, that really scared me, something might end up softening or settling in my body. And then there's often this response and this, this resonance kind of in the field. And it's not just the horse that can feel that. And being more trained in like reading others' nervous system or reading my own, I can also often feel this resonance kind of in the field when something doesn't match and it doesn't feel safe and contribute to this felt sense of safety, of feeling safe and being gotten.
Yeah, it's this really is a conversation between two nervous systems. So well before a behavior shows up, in say the animal, the equine, there's a whole series of things playing out between ourselves and them way before a behavior shows up. And this is, I think, the beauty of what you're talking about is when we start to pick up on those subtleties sooner and sooner and sooner, we stop seeing behavior just as a set of problems that we have to fix, and more about it being a symptom of something that's playing out that has been unfolding for some time. And that if we start to recognize behavior as not the first thing, but actually the last thing, in this long sequence, we
Mhm.
might be able to start to intervene differently. And we're looking at the interplay and the parallel process between equine and human nervous systems in all sorts of contexts where equines and humans come together. And I think some of the students come to our program, or some people sometimes might not come to the program because they think, well, I keep getting it wrong, or I keep making so many errors, and who am I to show up and take this program? There's so much pressure to get it right. And I like to say that the path to attunement is paved with misattunement. And I know you, as a marriage and family therapist, Susanna, would have a lot to say around this idea of good enough parenting or good enough horse ownership or good enough humaning in relation to equines, but maybe you could say more here. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. And especially when we're talking about attachments and early attachment, I mean, research studies have shown that, you only have to get parenting about 30% right. So it's not being the perfect parent all the time. It's impossible to be, and it would put a lot of pressure on us. But so much about it is like to the how the repair looks like when we are misattuned. Um, and I think there's something so valuable in that people cannot always be attuned, or we cannot always be attuned to our horses or ourselves or the people around us, right? And but but the ability to repair, the ability to, if there's no bad intention, right, to reach back out and to come back into like social engagement, into real connection and care, is what is ultimately so repairing in the relationship. And
Mm.
I've experienced a lot of this with my own horses. I have two young horses, and doing some trailer loading with one of my young horses where I asked for too much, and it was too much. And I just, hey, let's backtrack. Let's go back. I realize that happened. Let's do something different, or let's move away from the thing. And I'm really sorry I did this, and let's do it different. And I think the intention we put out there of the repair is immediately felt by the other without words. I mean, the horse probably doesn't understand my words of what I'm saying, but it has that felt sense of what happened in my physiology as I said that.
Mhm. Yeah, something changed. It didn't continue down the path that it always does, which is into more overwhelm, more frustration, more disconnect, more shutdown. It stopped.
Mhm.
And whatever was starting to build came back down and dissipated, and something different got to play out. than the standard, you know, way things always unfold.
Mhm.
And that's felt. We can feel a sequence that we're used to not playing out in the way that we anticipate, where that sequence gets interrupted and then unfolds differently. And that the more we can do that, the more we can catch it earlier within ourselves and within them, the more something has the chance to change for both
Mhm.
of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Mhm.
Mm.
Because oftentimes so many things are starting to happen before the actual behavior happens. And if we can start slowing that down, and I can think of, various examples kind of that fall into this category, but oftentimes something greater can shift, and a greater core belief can potentially shift as a result. So we don't have to use these down regulation strategies so much all the time. And I'm curious, if you can think of an example as well.
Mm. Yeah, so many. One that comes to mind is person had a horse and was struggling with a particular behavior. They were calling their horse pushy, boundary issues, in my space, disrespectful, and the horse had a particular behavior of being a little nippy. And I remember when I asked information about this, I said, can you share more information about what you mean by nippy? And they said, well, the horse will kind of use their teeth and grab onto things in my personal space. So grab onto my jacket or grab onto my something I'm holding, like my crop or something. But often clothing, but not exclusively so. And was framing this horse's behavior as a problem that needed to be fixed. And I was really curious about what was showing up before that. So there's always, the history. What do we know about the history? What do we know that's there in the background for equine and for human? And I hadn't had a chance to get into too much of the history, but I was curious about what was going on for the human whenever this behavior would happen, and the horse was there. And I said, as you notice this behavior happening for the horse, I wonder what happens for you. What are you noticing for yourself? And they were connected with a lot of things like frustration and, different things. And they seemed pretty elevated. And it was interesting because it was in getting to know more about the rider's experience that the horse's behavior started to show up again
Mm.
in that moment. So horse, was standing there and then starts to reach over and does this nipping sort of behavior that the person was saying, and grabs at the jacket or grabbed at, something else that the person was holding. And I was like, if we slowed this down, what are you noticing about your own nervous system state? And what do we notice about the horse's nervous system state? And the horse's, what this person was calling nipping behavior, would occur just before the human would disconnect and go up into their heads and get very anxious and possibly even seem a little spacey and not really connected. And it wasn't happening at other times. It was happening at a very particular point in the sequence. And through the course of the passage of time and sort of teasing this apart and slowing it down more and more, this pattern was in response to the disconnect and the charge or the arousal in the system of the human, but was being framed as a problem behavior in the horse that needed to be quote unquote fixed. And the horse's behavior reflected the horse's nervous system response to the human's nervous system response. And in digging a little further, it was interesting because this pattern of anxiety and dissociation in the human wasn't a long-standing one, but it had been happening as a result of a series of falls that had occurred. And so the human was like, whenever I go to ride, it's interesting now that you say that. Whenever I go to the barn, I am going to ride, but my horse always does this thing. And it's always in the context of the sequence leading up to the ride. And there
Mhm.
was a pretty major fall and a head injury in the history that hadn't ever been reworked or worked through. And so this human was overriding to just get back on the horse and get back in the saddle. And so it was a really powerful moment of finding the entry point and going, okay, it's not the behavior is maybe where we're starting from, but it's not the starting place. It's the end of this sequence. And if we back it up sooner and sooner and we start to tease apart, we might be able to start to work on renegotiating and releasing what's there. So there was work that needed to be done around the fall and work needing to be done around the head injury because the owner still had fear around getting in the saddle. And the equine was picking up on that. And the equine was
Yes.
also in that fall. So the equine also had likely some anticipatory
Mm,
charge or anxiety around being ridden again because the horse was still also in recovery from that fall and, you know, lacking trust in itself and the owner. So
mhm,
there was this big piece that was needing and wanting to be worked through that was held in the queue for both of them. That
mhm.
had we stayed at the level of the behavior, we would not have gotten very far.
Absolutely. Wow, this is a great example. And it's also such a good example of, you know, the reenactments of something that's happening over and over again in that
Mm-hmm.
same sequence pattern. And having worked a lot with faults myself or motor vehicle accidents or TBI, traumatic brain injuries, it is something that you see quite frequently where people might fall in a similar manner or have similar accidents again. And it makes so much sense that, especially if the horse was also affected, you know, that there was a reenactment potentially also for the horse and for both
Yeah,
in that sequence. And
yeah,
what a gift to slow that down and to be able to renegotiate something for something else to happen, and anything that was so suppressed potentially to be able to work
yeah.
through the physiology.
Mm.
It's a great example.
It speaks
Wow.
to that difference between like just finding like a behavior to fix and finding a strategy to override or make
Mhm,
myself feel calmer to overcome my anxiety, for instance. And I'm going
mhm,
to do something to shape this behavior differently. And I'm going to do something over here to maybe breathe through it and try to talk to myself and give myself some affirmations to get through my fear. But it's all masking the underlying
mhm.
physiology, the underlying nervous system pattern. And so while those things can maybe be useful at certain times, we're looking at trying to get to something deeper that's underneath. Yeah,
Yeah,
for both.
yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
That makes sense that what is suppressed, right, and
Yeah.
kind of takes away from our life energy. Mhm,
One thing I appreciate a lot about this conversation, Susanna, is this idea of how universal all of this is. We're all mammals. We all have a nervous system,
mhm,
and we're responding to cues in one another's nervous systems all the time. And so whatever is in the cue, we're going to respond to it, whether consciously or unconsciously. And so will the equines. And I think this way of working or this way of framing or understanding things um, just is so powerful, both in terms of our own personal relationships with other species, but also in the professional scopes that we work when we're working with equines and other humans in various contexts. There's something really powerful about shifting, I think, away from finding behavior to fix or teaching another skill, a downregulation technique, that kind of idea, and moving away from sort of strictly behavioral methodology, which is helpful and has its place. And learning how to use behavioral methods well and ethically is really important. And there's so much more that can be done before we even get to looking at behavioral methods. So, whether, regardless of whether you're, wanting to teach some sort of regulation strategy to a human or you're trying to do some sort of like clicker training or, negative reinforcement type work, even before all of that, there's all this nervous system state stuff. There's all this relational field stuff, this rupture and repair stuff, this trauma
mhm,
renegotiation stuff. And when we attend to those bits and pieces, the other stuff that we do shifts, or the
yeah,
need for the other stuff shifts, or it unfolds differently
mhm,
because we've addressed what's in the queue before. the behavior shows up in all of these different contexts. And I think
Mhm.
that's what I find so transformational about this style of working. And if any of this conversation feels resonant to you, either personally with your own equines or professionally in the work that you do with human and or equine clients, there's space available. Our next level 1 cohort is starting in January, and it is entirely online. Level 2 is a mix of online and in person, but our next level 1 cohort is coming up pretty soon. And so we would love to get to know you, get to hear about your journey, and see if and how we can support things to shift for the humans, the equines, and yourself that are connected to you in the work that you do and in your personal life. I've made many mistakes, in my life, and there's this grace around being able to begin again, a humility around being able to begin again. And I find this work to be so forgiving. There's always another choice point, always another opportunity to experience it differently. It's never too late. It's never too late. And I think that's one of the things that I wish more people knew is there's all this pressure and this urgency, and we may get so used to the pressure and the urgency because that's what our nervous system is used to, and maybe the horses are also used to that pressure and urgency from us. And if we pause and allow something to soften and work on repatterning that, so much more gets to unfold that isn't that. And something different can happen at any point. Just because something has been this way for this long doesn't mean that it can't shift or that something can't be different. And that's the really beautiful, forgiving quality of this work is there's always another opportunity, always.
Mhm.
And so, again, if this resonates with you, we'd love to hear from you and we'd love to see you in the next cohort. Bye for now.
Goodbye. Welcome.